Hello, and welcome to this video. It's going to go through the use of the scanner class to read input from a text file, which is very helpful if you're ever testing a program with very large sets of data that you don't want to necessarily type in every time that you run a program, or it allows you to test a program repeatedly using the same set of data without having to type in that information. It can be very helpful as you get further and further along in larger and larger programs. We'll also explore the creation of and use of methods that are written by the programmer, so some reminders, some limits, some restrictions, things that you need to remember while you're going through this. This is going to be very useful for your next program. First off, you will need to download the text file review 2016.java file from Google Classroom. You'll also need to download the cp3date.java file from Google Classroom, and then copy and paste the information that's in the data.txt file. Do not download that file directly. There's some extra characters that get inputted into text files in Google Classroom, so if you try to download it and put it into a new file here, it's not going to work. So what you want to do is open it in Google Classroom, highlight everything, copy it, come in here, go to File, New, Untitled Text File, paste the information, and then save it as data.txt. And make sure that you do that all lowercase and that you put in the extension .txt. So once you have done that, you'll get a file similar to this one. So a few things up at the top. You're going to import the java.io.file class that's written in there, and this is a pre-written class that allows you to create a file object type. So you actually kind of take a file, which will be our data.txt file, and create it as an object that you can then work with, similar to like when we worked with person or student or picture last year. Scanner, used to process user input, and in this case we're going to use it with our text file. And then array list, because we're going to use the array list class when we're looking at our methods. So a data structure that is an object type and resizable. So you're going to notice first thing that happens in this file is that we create a new scanner, and we go ahead and set it equal to the keyboard, just so that it's already created, it's initialized. Then there's what's called a try catch block. And what it says is that you're going to try to run some code, and hopefully it'll work. So what we're going to try to do is reassign in to equal a new scanner, but instead of reading from the computer, the keyboard, we're going to read from a new file called data.txt. So it's actually going to go in here and use this as if the user was typing all of this information in. So think of it like the scanner starts here, and if I did a next line, it would read in everything that is written on this entire line. If I had some numbers in here, I could call next int, next double to process through that. So whatever I write in here is just like what the user would type in the console if they were running a program. The reason it's in a try catch block is because if this file does not exist, it's going to create an error in your program, and immediately it's going to shut down your program. And what we want to do is, instead of it crashing our program, what we want it to do is, if it doesn't find the file, we want it to just output this nice little error message. So let's say that I was looking for something like data2.txt. And as you can see over here, there's no file in my CP3 programs project named data2.txt. So if I save this, I go and try and run it, I get cannot find file, exiting program. And it runs, it's not still running down here, I'm not having any issues. If I take out that 2, save it, and run it, now notice that it did something. It ran through because it's not still currently running, but nothing outputted. So I could output something like it worked, just to test and see that it actually kind of got through all of the main method, because here's the end of my main method. and here it says it worked. So it found the file, it would be able to read from it, we would be good to go. This is code that you should just kind of keep in your toolbox of code to come back to. Know that you do have to import 2 different files to be able to use it, and that whatever this name is what you should see in a matching text file over here in a project. And make sure if you're having trouble sometimes, make sure that this data.txt file or whatever file you're reading from is not in your default package. It should not be located in here because it won't be found. If I try to run this, it says cannot find file. That data.txt has to be in the outer project in that CP3 programs or whatever you've named that project. And now you can see that it found it. So imagine that this is acting like my keyboard. So what I want to do is I've created a new string, created as just an empty string, created an empty array list, and then I'm going to say as long as in, which is my text file, has a next, so there is something else inside of that text file. I want word to equal the next thing, and there's this neat method for strings called replace. So what I'm saying is that if it finds a comma anywhere inside of Word, I want it to replace it with just a space. So I'm just using this really to get rid of punctuation. So it gets rid of any commas in the input. And same thing here, this would get rid of any periods, any exclamation points, any question marks. And then I add to my list. So if I come down in here, and let's say instead of outputting it worked, I say something like list.get 0. So I want to print out the first thing in my list. I can do that. I could also very easily print out the last thing in my list. So save it, run it. Errors exist. Oh, I have an extra parenthesis in there. So lorem and x. If you go to your text file, notice that lorem is the first word here, and I go all the way to the end of this last line, and it's ex with the period. Notice that no period outputted here because I've replaced that. So you could also look at, say, the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th word here has a comma, and when I do next, it's going to output for me, it takes from wherever the cursor currently is to the next space. So let's say I want to output the 5th thing. Remember that the 5th thing would be at index 4. I get a met with no comma after it, whereas a met here gave me a comma. So this processes through now all of that input. So instead of me having to go in and type in all of these words, I've immediately and quickly gotten a ton of information inside of my list. And you can see how many items are actually inside of the list by printing its size. There's 376 words now in my list, and I didn't have to type in a single thing. I've just read them all straight from this text file. So what we want to do now is take a look at how I can call a method. So let's say that as I'm going through my program, I want to be able to print out the contents of the list, and I know I'm going to do it a bunch of times. I could write the code and copy and paste it every time, but that's really not efficient, and it's really not the way that we should program. So what I want to do is I want to create a method that I can call that will output my list in the exact format that I want it every time that I want to output my list. So I'm going to label this original list, and I want to write a method called printList, and I'm going to send it list. So I'm going to say, hey, I have this list, I want it printed. Well, printList we have to define. So I'm going to come down here outside of main, before my class ends, and that's where I'm going to go ahead and write my method. Now notice that I didn't call it, I didn't say list.printlist, I just said printlist. So that means that this is a static method. I can call it without needing an object. And I really don't need to return anything because I'm just going to print out the list. And then inside of here, it's going to take any array list of strings. So I am kind of limiting what I can print. It has to be an array list of strings. Because I'm going to use a simple for each loop for every string x inside of my sent list. I'm going to print out x. And you may say that's only 2 lines of code. I could easily put it in there, and you could. I'm just using this kind of an example of how I can create a method that I can call at any time. I'm sending it something, and it's going to go through and process that information. So if I needed, let's say, this was more complex, and there was 30 lines of code involved in every time I printed a list. Well, then I'd write those 30 lines of code one time, and then every time I need to call it, I would just say print list. So if I save this, I run it, take a look at my console, you can see that there's all 376 of my words. So here's original list, and then here's each word, no commas, no exclamation points, no question marks, no periods after anything. Alright. Let's say I wanted to go through though and I wanted to make changes to my list. And you want to be careful anytime that you're making changes to a list. Remember that items are going to shift, so you have to be very careful. So I want to go through and I want to remove all the small elements from a list. So I'm going to set some kind of size, let's say 4, and anything that's under 4 letters, so 0, 1, 2, or 3, I want to remove from the list. So I come down here. Now because I am sending the list, I don't need to return it. It's an object. As long as I don't totally change the object by making it equal something new, then I don't need to return it. The changes will take place and stick with the list because it's an object. So I send list and I send the number 4. So size is that size of how many letters I want to remove. So I'm going to go with a for loop, and one way you can kind of go through a loop or an array list when you're removing is start from the end. By starting at the end, I don't have to worry about skipping items when I go through them, because as I process, the things behind it are shifting. Just make sure that you start at size -1, that you include the thing at 0, and that you subtract from that index as you're going through it. So what I'm going to say is if I get the thing from my list at spot X, and I'm going to trim it, because remember I put in all those extra spaces, if that thing's length is less than whatever my size is, then I want to remove it. So I'm going backwards through my list, so I don't have to worry about skipping things. I'm getting the element that's at X, trimming it, getting rid of any extra spaces at the beginning or the end. And if the length of the trimmed string is less than size, I'm going to remove it. And then what I can do then is I can come up here and print out my removed list. I'm going to put in a new line just so it's a little easier to see in the console. So now if I look through here, here's my original list. I had a whole bunch of words that are short. And I come down here here's my removed list. And notice that I have things that are 4, but I don't have anything that is shorter than 4 characters. So if it had 0, 1, 2, or 3 characters, it's been removed from my list. And that'll work anytime that you make changes to an array list, as long as you are calling a method. So the change that I made was removing it, and I called a method, then that change will stick with the list, and I don't have to return it as I'm going through it. Okay. As we're going through this, now, hold on, where did my recorder go? Now let's look and see what happens if I do something where I am making a change. So let's say that I wanted to create something that would clear a list. So I want to just remove everything from the list. One easy way that we think that we can do this is simply to say, hey, sent list should equal a new array list of strings. Boom. So that'll clear my list. I'll be done, ready to go. It'll be nice and empty. So if I want to print it again, take a look at that cleared list. And I go ahead and print out my list. Go to run it. Notice that after cleared list, I still get all of those words. And the reason being that when you make a change to the entire data structure, I've given it a completely new memory location. That change will not take place when I go back up into main. If I make a change based on a method call, that change will stick. If I totally reassign my data structure, that change will not stick. If I wanted to do something like actually clear the list, then I would have to return the list. Now I return that list, and I come up here and I say list equals, oops, not print list, up here, list equals clear list. I'm reassigning it in both locations. Now my cleared list is totally empty. So you want to be very careful. You can call methods to change data structures, but if you totally reassign it, then you will need to return it and actually reassign it inside of main to hold on to that chain. That's with objects. I want to take a look at a simple example with some primitive data types, so you remember how primitives are going to work a little bit differently. So I've got val1, that equals 10. I've got val2, that's going to equal 2.5. And then I'm going to output what val1 equals. And what val2 equals. So I know what my starting values are. I'm going to create a method where I just want to add val1 and val2. And then after that method call, I'm going to print out val1 and val2 again. And I'm going to print out what result equals. So pretty simple. I just want to add two numbers together. I can go through, create another static method. It's going to return a double. I'm going to add, it takes an int, val1, an int double, val2. And let's say that I want to check and see what happens if I try to make changes. So let's say val1 equals val1 times 2, val2 times, so plus equals 10. So I've changed val1 and val2. I'm going to return val1 plus val2. So I've got two primitives that get sent. I'm going to change them. So if I think about what should happen here, in my method call up here, val1 was 10. So it sent 10 down here. So now val1 should equal 20. And right here, val2 was originally 2.5, but I added 10. So val2 should equal 12.5. And I could even test that really easily. I'm just going to give myself a little note that I'm inside the method right here. And now I'm leaving the method. Make sure we see the difference in the values up here. So I run this. Here was val1 and val2 to begin with, 10 and 2.5. I go inside the method, val1 and val2 changed. I leave the method. I print val1 and val2 again, and they're back to the original values. When you send primitives, it doesn't matter if you name them the same thing, it doesn't matter if you name them different things. I name this val 2000. Named the same or not, as I go through this, changes to primitives that are made inside of a method will not stick when I go back outside of that method. Now result ended up being adding those two values up, 20 plus 12.5. So be careful as you're going through things. There is no way to change a primitive value when you send it to a method as you're going through that. And the same thing could be true if I use my CP3 date. If I call add day, that change will take place. But if I went through and tried to recreate the date in something, that would not work. And that change would not take place. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. In your next program, you will be using a very large text file called article.txt. And you can see that it has tons and tons of words in it. And you're going to use this text file reader, so very similar code to what this is here. And it's actually given to you. I gave you a starter file to use. And then you're going to create a menu and process through the inputs, focusing on using your array list. And you do need to create methods when you're going through and processing your information. One thing you have to be careful of, after you've gone through and you have created a scanner that's going to read from a text file, if you then are going to be processing data from the keyboard, you have to do one of two things. Either set your scanner back to system.in by just copying this part of the code, or create a new scanner that you're going to use like in2 or key B, so you know that's the one that's dealing with your keyboard. And then you'll use in.nextLine, in.nextInt, in.nextDouble, whatever methods you need to read information from the keyboard. So good luck as you go through your next program.